The night is calm, the fire is low, and tonight we step back thousands of years to the banks of the Nile, together. We will drift into the world of ancient Egypt, not through battles or temples, but through the quiet, tender, and sometimes strange ways that Egyptians understood love and marriage. This is a story told slowly in detail, so you can rest as you listen. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to The Boring Historian, your place for calming history, perfect for sleep. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? I'd love to know. The story begins at the edge of the river. The sun is setting, the reeds are swaying, and the Nile flows on as it has for thousands of years. To the ancient Egyptians, this river was not only water, but life itself. From its steady rhythm, they learned what it meant to love, to give, to take, to balance, and to endure. Imagine standing on the banks of the Nile at dusk. The air is warm, heavy with the scent of mud and lotus blossoms. Villagers return from the fields, their baskets full of barley and emmer wheat, their feet dusty, their voices carrying across the water. The day of labor is done, and the night brings with it another rhythm, the rhythm of gathering, of laughter, of music, and of companionship. These quiet hours, love first found its place. Life in an Egyptian village was simple, yet it carried moments of beauty. Homes were built from mud brick, clustered close together for shade and comfort. Courtyards smelled of baking bread, of onions frying in oil, of beer brewing in clay jars. Children played in the dust, chasing each other with shrieks of laughter. And somewhere nearby, the sound of a flute rose into the air, soft, winding, and almost hypnotic. For many young men and women, such music was the backdrop of their earliest encounters. Festivals were the heart of Egyptian social life, and it was there that love was often kindled. In the glow of torchlight, people gathered to honor the gods with offerings, songs, and dance. Drums echoed like heartbeats, while singers raised their voices in praise of Hathor, goddess of love, joy, and music. To the Egyptians, love was not a sin, nor was it something to hide in shame. It was celebrated openly, woven into the very fabric of religion. At one such festival, imagine a young man catching sight of a girl he had only glimpsed before while working in the fields. Tonight, she wears a simple linen dress, her hair braided and perfumed with lotus oil. She is laughing with her friends, her bracelets chiming as she moves. He feels a stirring not only desire but admiration. To the Egyptians, beauty was a gift from the gods, and the sight of it inspired poetry as much as longing. Their first exchange might be fleeting, a shared glance, a smile, perhaps a few words spoken over the rhythm of a drum. Love, in ancient Egypt, often began in this way, quietly, gently, without ceremony. The people of the Nile valued balance above all things, and in love, they sought harmony, not turmoil. A man might later write verses on a scrap of papyrus, comparing the girl's voice to birdsong, or her eyes to cool pools of water. Egyptian love poetry survives even today, full of metaphors drawn from the natural world. The river, the lotus, the palm tree, the sweet fig, all became symbols of desire and affection. But it was not only festivals that brought lovers together. Daily life itself offered chances to meet. The fields, the markets, the riverbanks, where women fetched water, all were places where young people crossed paths. In a small village, everyone knew each other, and word of a blossoming romance spread quickly. Mothers watched carefully, fathers weighed possibilities, and yet, love often had its own quiet power. Even in a world shaped by duty and survival, the Egyptians understood the pull of the heart. What made their view of love unique was how natural it seemed to them. They did not divide passion from marriage as harshly as some later societies would. Love was not seen as weakness, nor as something dangerous. It was a gift, a joy, and, when nurtured, a foundation for family and stability. Love, like the Nile itself, was a source of life. It might flood suddenly, fierce and overwhelming, but it always returned to its steady flow, nourishing all it touched. As the evening deepens in our imagined village, the music lingers and the festival grows lively. Couples slip away from the crowd, walking under the palms by the river. The moon rises, casting silver light across the water. They talk in whispers, laughing softly, their footsteps leaving faint prints in the sand. To them, This is not a fleeting game, but something eternal, tied to the gods, to Maat. The cosmic balance that governed the universe, love was not chaos. It was harmony, as necessary as the rising of the sun. In this way, the Egyptians shaped their understanding of love. It was beauty, yes, but it was also duty. It was joy, but also respect. A husband and wife were seen not only as companions, but as two halves of a whole, bound by balance and by the will of the gods. To the young man and woman standing by the Nile, this might not yet be fully clear. For now, they are simply two hearts drawn together under the stars. But in time, their bond will grow into something larger. A union recognized by family, by community, and by eternity itself. And so, love along the Nile began with a glance, a song, a festival, a riverbank walk. It began with balance, with admiration, with beauty reflected in the natural world. The Egyptians, perhaps more than many other peoples of the ancient world, embraced love as both human and divine. For them, it was not separate from life, but at the very heart of it. This is where our story begins. With the Nile, with its steady current, and with the quiet, eternal rhythm of love that flowed beside. The festival is ended, the torches dim, and the village slips into a hush. But for some, the night lingers in memory. The way a smile glowed in the firelight, or how the sound of a laugh stayed in the air long after the drums had faded. In ancient Egypt, romance often began in moments like these, small sparks in the rhythm of daily life. For young men and women, courtship was rarely grand or formal. It was woven instead into the fabric of ordinary days. Imagine a young woman rising at dawn, filling her jar at the river. The light catches her reflection in the water, and nearby a young man, working on a fishing net, notices. He calls a greeting, casual at first, but his voice carries a warmth he cannot hide. She smiles, adjusts the jar on her shoulder, and answers softly before walking on. Nothing more is said, but the silence is filled with possibility. Love in ancient Egypt found its voice in poetry. On scraps of papyrus, or even etched onto shards of broken pottery, verses were written that still survive across millennia. They are tender, playful, and surprisingly modern in their intimacy. A young man might write, "I cannot hold back my heart when I think of her. She is a star, shining at dawn." A girl might answer in kind, "It is good to go to the pool to bathe, for I know he will be watching." These were not lofty hymns for kings or gods, but the personal expressions of ordinary people, reaching for words to describe feelings as old as time. Many of the poems draw on the imagery of the natural world, the lotus flower opening to the sun, the sweetness of ripe figs, the joy of a bird singing after rain. To the Egyptians, nature and love were inseparable, both gifts of the gods, both parts of the eternal cycle of life. Courtship often unfolded during community gatherings, festivals, harvest celebrations, and dances dedicated to Hathor or Bastet. Music played a vital role: flutes, harps, and sistrums. Small rattling instruments filled the air with rhythm. Couples found excuses to draw near, exchanging glances over the beat of the drums. A touch of the hand, a passing of a flower, a whispered word. These were the beginnings of romance. Playfulness was at the heart of much of this courtship. Poems describe teasing, laughter, and the thrill of stolen moments. One verse imagines a girl saying, "He watches me as I pass by. I will not look, though I know he is there. My heart leaps like a fish in the river." Such words remind us that Egyptian lovers were not so different from ourselves, shy, hopeful, caught between restraint and longing. But romance was not only a private matter. Villages were close-knit, and every gesture was seen. Friends carried messages, mothers took note of conversations, and fathers kept a careful eye. Even so, young people found ways to meet. In the fields, as they harvested barley, they worked side by side, trading jokes and smiles. The riverbank drawing water, they lingered longer than they needed to. Love thrived in the spaces between duty and watchfulness, and the little pauses of the day. The gods, too, played their part. Hathor, goddess of love and beauty, was often invoked in songs and prayers. Couples asked for her blessing, hoping she would bring sweetness to their union. To love was not only human, but divine, and Egyptians did not see desire as shameful. It was sacred, a gift that bound people together, just as the Nile bound the land. One can picture an evening where a young man brings a lotus blossom to the girl he admires. Its petals are open, fragrant, delicate. He places it in her hand without words, and she accepts it, her eyes lowering shyly. In that gesture, an entire conversation takes place, one of affection, respect, and hope. In a world without letters for everyone, such symbols spoke volumes. These first stirrings of romance were fragile yet powerful. They carried the promise of more, of shared meals, of building a home, of raising children, of walking side by side into eternity. But in the moment, they were simply joy, the joy of being seen, of being admired, of knowing that in the vast cycle of life along the Nile, someone's heart had chosen you. Egyptian love poetry captures this joy again and again. My heart is in his hand. I cannot keep it to myself. Or, it is her voice that fills me with life. It is her laughter that makes me forget hunger. These verses are not distant relics. They are the voices of people who lived thousands of years ago, whispering across time the same emotions we feel today. And so, in the fields, at the river, at festivals glowing with torchlight, young Egyptians discovered the first stirrings of romance. It was shy, it was playful, it was hidden in glances and gestures, yet it carried the weight of eternity. Just as the Nile's flood began with a single drop of rain far to the south, so too did love begin with a single look, a smile, a word, a blossom placed in the hand. From these beginnings, courtship would grow into something more formal, something that families and communities would shape. But here, in the tender space between youth and duty, between poetry and promise, love first took root, and once rooted, it would flourish like the lotus opening to the dawn. The shy glances and playful teasing of courtship could only last so long. Along the Nile, love was cherished, but marriage was the ground upon which society stood. To the ancient Egyptians, a partner was not simply a companion of the heart. They were also a partner in labor, in household management, in raising children, and in honoring the gods. To choose a spouse was to shape the future, not only for oneself, but for one's family, one's children, and even for the eternal journey into the afterlife. In a small village, word of a budding romance did not stay secret for long. A mother might notice her daughter's sudden fondness for visiting the river at certain hours, or a father might catch sight of his son lingering at the edge of a festival dance. Families paid attention. Marriage was more than a private matter. It was an arrangement that tied households together, bound property, and ensured stability in a world where survival often depended on cooperation. Still, unlike in many ancient cultures, Egyptian men and women had a surprising amount of choice in the matter. Parents guided, advised, and sometimes intervened, but young couples often had a say in their own unions. A father might speak to his son about the girl he admired, her family's reputation, her skills in keeping a household, her ability to weave cloth or manage grain stores. A mother might whisper to her daughter about the young man's prospects, his trade, his reliability, his good character. These discussions were practical, but beneath them lay the gentle spark of affection already kindled. Marriage contracts began to appear more commonly in the New Kingdom, but even before then, the spirit of agreement was central. These contracts were not about lavish ceremonies or political alliances alone. They laid out simple but important matters. A man pledged to support his wife, to provide food, clothing, and shelter. If a divorce were to happen, the woman had rights, often the return of her dowry, sometimes even a share of the household goods. These documents show that Egyptians saw marriage as both a bond of love and a binding legal partnership. For many couples, class and work played as large a role as emotion. A farmer's daughter was more likely to marry another farmer's son, their shared labor essential for survival. Craftsmen might marry within their guilds, a weaver joining with a potter, their skills complementing one another. Among the elite, of course, considerations were grander. Land, estates, and political alliances shaped unions. But even then, affection was not absent. In letters and inscriptions, even high-born Egyptians speak of their spouses with tenderness, not just as partners in duty, but as beloved companions. The act of choosing was a delicate balance between heart and home, between affection and obligation. Imagine a young man sitting with his father beneath a fig tree, speaking of the girl he loves. His father listens, nods, then asks, "Does she come from a good family? Does she know the work of the household? Will she stand by you when the Nile runs low, when harvests are thin?" The son hesitates, then smiles. "Yes," he says. He believes she will. The father, weighing both the heart and the harvest, gives his blessing. For women, choice was just as significant. A girl might confide in her mother about the young man who brought her lotus flowers. Her mother, remembering her own youth, might weigh her daughter's words carefully. Does he have a trade? Does he honor the gods? Will he treat you with respect? A daughter's heart mattered, but so did her security, her independence, and her future children's well-being. Marriage was, at its core, about building a home. The Egyptians placed great importance on the household, the the center of life. To marry was to begin shaping a space of one's own, where bread would be baked, children would be born, offerings would be made to the household gods. A husband and wife were partners in this work, and the choice of partner determined how well that home would endure. Love, however, was never far from these considerations. The Egyptians, unlike some later cultures, did not dismiss affection as a trivial matter. Their poetry, their songs, their tender inscriptions show us that emotion and duty walked hand in hand. A husband might still write to his wife decades after marriage, calling her my beloved. A wife might be buried with words carved on her tomb. She was the one who gave me joy each day. Choosing a partner, then, was not merely a transaction, nor was it entirely a matter of the heart. It was both. It was the weaving together of love and responsibility, of affection and endurance. Just as the Nile flooded each year to nourish the land, so too did marriage balance passion with stability, ensuring the survival of families and the flourishing of life along the river. And so, as the shy glances turned into conversations, as families gave their blessings, as agreements were written and expectations laid out, a young couple prepared for the next step. Their love had grown from a spark into something stronger, steadier, ready to be blessed by gods and celebrated by community. Ahead lay the wedding itself, with music, food, laughter, and rituals. But for now, the choice had been made. Two lives would be joined, bound by affection, by duty, and by the eternal flow of the Nile. Picture the morning of a wedding in a Nile-side village. The sun is still low, thin mist lifting from the river, and the air is full of the small, bright sounds of preparation. Today is a turning point, not only for two young people, but for two households, for futures to be woven together like linen threads. The day unfolds slowly, deliberately, each movement carrying meaning. In ancient Egypt, weddings were less a single dramatic event and more a series of deliberate gestures, fragrant, musical, communal, that bound love to harmony. Fertility and mat, the balance that held the world together. The day begins with ablutions. The bride and groom, in separate houses at first, wash and anoint themselves with oils scented with lotus and myrrh. Cleanliness is a ritual of readiness. Linen garments are smoothed, hair is braided or arranged in simple, careful styles. And kohl is applied to the eyes not merely as makeup, but as protection from sun and spirit. For many, even the act of dressing is prayerful. White linen, the color of light, of purity, is preferred. The garb is plain for common folk and more ornate for those who can afford it, but even modest clothing takes on a ceremonial calm. The household bustles with women preparing bread, mixing beer, braiding garlands of flowers and palm fronds. Children run errands. Neighbors bring clay jugs and plates of dates and figs as gifts. The whole village is a gentle, humming machine of goodwill. Music begins to thread through the morning. The soft pluck of a harp, the low pulse of a drum, the thin high call of a flute. Musicians arrive with songs that are both celebratory and supplicatory, hymns to Hathor or Isis for love and motherhood, to Base or Torrid for protection in childbirth and the hearth. Sistrums clatter like laughter. The sound is not merely for show. It is a spoken blessing, an oral weaving of good fortune into the day. People dance in circles, hands held, feet keeping time with the river's steady pulse. Elders clap slowly, calling to Mat with repetitive rhythms that reassure the world is still in balance. Guests gather at both houses, parents, siblings, close friends, and sometimes the local elder or scribe, who will witness agreements. In towns and among elites, a formal contract may be recited, a practical declaration of the exchange of dowry, of property arrangements, and of the husband's responsibilities. For many commoners, such notes were less formal, but no less meaningful. Promises were spoken aloud, terms agreed, gifts exchanged. A man might present his future wife with a token, a bead necklace, a simple ring of braided reed, metal pendant, a physical vow that could be worn every day, like a whispered promise. The giving and receiving of such tokens is quiet but heavy with intention. Central to the ceremony is the invocation of the gods. Offerings are made at the household shrine, a small table with bread, beer, and a little model of a deity. A prayer asks for fertility, for the health of future children, for a household balanced in joy and duty. Hathor, goddess of love, music, and joy, receives praise alongside Isis, whose name evokes motherhood and protection, and Osiris, who connects life to the promise of rebirth. Even in the simplest households, these offerings anchor the marriage in a cosmic order. To marry is to invite divine stewardship into a relationship, to place the union under the watchful eye of forces that govern both life and afterlife. Food is prepared with care. Loaves of barley bread, platters of figs and dates, bowls of lentils, fish fresh from the river, or for those who can afford it, roasted meat. Brewing is an art, and beer is both a staple and a celebratory drink, shared from communal jars. Cooling tongues and loosening voices. The feast itself is slow and sociable. People sit on reed mats or low stools, passing dishes, offering toasts, telling stories. Laughter spills easily, and the music resumes between courses. Old men recount how they were wed. Women hum verses of love poetry while weaving garlands. In the sharing of food, the community recognizes the new household as part of its. When the celebrations of the wedding faded, life for an ancient Egyptian couple settled into the rhythms of the home. Imagine walking through the sandy paths of a small village at dusk. The golden light of the setting sun warms the mud brick walls of clustered houses, and the air carries the faint smell of baking bread and wood smoke. Somewhere a mother calls to her children, and goats shuffle back into their pens. For the newly married, this was the beginning of a life built not on grand palaces, but on simple routines and shared responsibilities. Most homes were built of sun-dried mud brick, sturdy, practical, and cool against the desert heat. The walls were plastered with mud or whitewash, and the roofs were flat, often used as extra space where food could dry in the sun, or where family members might sleep during hot nights. Inside, the rooms were small but full of life. A central room often served for cooking, eating, and gathering with low stools, woven mats, and jars of grain stacked neatly along the walls. In one corner might be a small shrine to the household gods, where the couple placed offerings of bread or flowers, asking for protection and fertility. Marriage was not only about romance but survival. A husband and wife became partners in the daily labor that sustained the family. Men might spend the day in the fields, tending barley, emmer wheat, or tending to irrigation channels drawn from the Nile. Women often managed the home, grinding grain, baking bread, weaving linen, and caring for children. Yet the boundaries were not rigid. Women could own property, run businesses, and in some cases even practice skilled trades. Couples often worked side by side, blending affection with the quiet strength of cooperation. Meals were at the heart of this bond. The couple, their children, and perhaps extended family shared bread, beer, onions, fish, and stews flavored with herbs. Eating together was not just about sustenance but about harmony. The table, or more often a simple mat on the floor, became the place where love was expressed through the sharing of food and stories. Children were treasured, seen as blessings and as the continuation of family and community. The sounds of little feet pattering across the clay floors, the laughter of siblings, and the careful lullabies sung by mothers filled these modest homes. Marriage meant not just the joining of two people, but the creation of a household, a place where life continued, where hope was renewed with each generation. Even in hardship, when the Nile flooded poorly or illness swept through the village, the strength of marriage was in its daily acts of loyalty. Love was not just in poetry or ceremony, but in a husband bringing home firewood or a wife preparing bread at dawn, or in two people sitting together under the stars on their flat roof, watching the river glisten in the moonlight. In ancient Egypt, marriage was not about dramatic declarations, but about balance, partnership, and care. A love as steady and enduring as the river itself. In the quiet glow of torchlight, when the day's work was finished and families retreated into their homes, ancient Egyptian life often turned inward, toward matters of the heart. Marriage, so deeply practical in its foundations, also carried with it ideals of loyalty and devotion. Across surviving texts, from fragments of poetry to legal contracts, we can see how Egyptians dreamed of love's constancy. Even as they wrestled with the all-too-human emotions of jealousy, betrayal, and disappointment, love songs from the New Kingdom reveal a tender vision of faithfulness. In them, lovers speak of their hearts beating only for one another, of eyes that cannot turn away, of longing that makes the body weak. The imagery is striking. A woman might describe her beloved as the Nile itself, essential to her life, while a man might speak of his lover as a lotus flower, pure and radiant. These verses, copied onto papyri or painted onto walls, carried the message that true love was meant to be steadfast, a binding of souls as much as bodies. Yet reality was seldom so perfect. Infidelity was not unknown, and its wounds could run deep. Some records tell of jealous quarrels, of suspicions that broke the peace of households. In a society where fertility and family honor mattered so greatly, an unfaithful partner was not just betraying affection, but also threatening stability. Anger and jealousy could find their way into songs as well, verses describing the ache of being ignored, or the torment of imagining a rival. These emotions, though thousands of years old, feel remarkably familiar, a reminder that the struggles of love are timeless. Legally, Egyptian wives enjoyed protections unusual in much of the ancient world. Marriage contracts, often carefully drawn up, could state what property a wife brought into the union, and what she was entitled to if the marriage dissolved. A wife could initiate divorce, and if she did, She was often allowed to keep her dowry, and sometimes a portion of shared wealth. Such protections reveal a society that, while not perfectly equal, recognized the importance of women's rights within marriage. Divorce itself, though not common, was not scandalous. It was treated as a practical reality rather than a moral failing. A husband or wife might decide the union was no longer working, and the separation could be formally agreed upon, witnessed, and recorded. Children remained cherished, and efforts were often made to ensure they were provided for, regardless of the parents' personal conflicts. The contrast between the lofty ideals of poetry and the practical realities of daily life creates a poignant tension. On one hand, marriage was celebrated as eternal, blessed by gods like Hathor and Isis, who themselves embodied love and devotion. On the other, human frailty, jealousy, betrayal, disappointment constantly threatened that vision. And yet, perhaps it is this very tension that made Egyptian views of love so enduring. They dreamed of loyalty not because it was easy, but because it was hard. They praised faithfulness in poems precisely because it was fragile, something that could be lost if not carefully guarded. In this way, the story of love in ancient Egypt becomes not just one of ideals, but of humanity itself, yearning for devotion, fearing betrayal, and seeking balance between passion and trust. In the end, their marriages, like their lives, were lived between the dream of permanence and the reality of change. A quiet dance of hope and vulnerability, played out in mud brick homes along the Nile. In the hush of ancient Egypt's desert winds, where the Nile threaded its way like a lifeline through the land, love and marriage were not built upon the same rigid hierarchies we often imagine in the ancient world. For Egyptian women, life within the bonds of marriage held a degree of freedom that might surprise us today. Unlike in Greece, where women were secluded, or in Rome, where they lived under constant male guardianship, Egyptian women stood as partners. Their names etched into contracts, their rights recognized by law, and their voices woven into the poetry of the age. When a woman entered marriage, she did not vanish into her husband's household as a possession. She arrived as an individual in her own right. She could inherit property, manage land, and conduct business. She could bring her dowry into the marriage, and if love soured or circumstances shifted, she could leave the union and still retain her wealth. In this way, the Egyptian household was not simply a man's domain, but a shared space where husband and wife built their lives together. This independence was more than legal, it was cultural. In poems and songs of the Nile, women are not silent shadows. Their playful voices, whispering of longing, teasing their beloveds, and demanding devotion. Some verses are written from a woman's perspective, describing the sweetness of waiting for her lover at the festival or the delight of stealing a private glance in a crowded street. Love for Egyptians was mutual. It was not a man's conquest or a woman's submission, but a harmony of affection and desire. Inside the home, this balance took form in everyday partnership. A wife often oversaw the household, weaving linen, preparing bread, and managing the rhythms of domestic life. A husband worked in the fields or at his craft, but together they were bound not only by love, but by survival. The land demanded cooperation, and so did the family. Children, elders, servants, and kin lived under the same roof, each contributing to the fragile balance of life. A woman's role was central in keeping this harmony alive. And yet, Egyptian women's strength reached beyond the walls of home. Records from dusty papyri reveal women suing in courts, buying and selling property, and even adopting children. In some cases, widows raised families entirely on their own, respected as heads of their households. In marriage, this translated into a partnership where a wife could stand equal to her husband, not in every sense, but in enough ways to make Egyptian society strikingly different from its neighbors. This equality carried into the very way Egyptians thought about love. In songs, the beloved woman is not a distant figure, locked away and untouchable. She is a force of presence, her eyes compared to stars, her voice to music, her words shaping her lover's heart. The language of romance shows us that women were not merely admired, they were adored, listened to, and often obeyed. Love was not one-sided, but a dialogue between equals, each voice carrying weight in the shared story of marriage. Of course, life was not without its shadows. A woman's rights could be ignored, her choices constrained by family or circumstance. Poverty, illness, or politics could strip away independence. But in the larger sweep of history, Egyptian women stand out as remarkably empowered. Their role in love and marriage woven into the cultural fabric is essential and respected. As we drift deeper into this story, we see marriage in ancient Egypt, not as domination, but as balance mat, the sacred order of the world, reflected within the home. Husband and wife were expected to live in harmony, each with duties, each with freedoms, bound together by affection, loyalty, and the shared labor of survival along the Nile. It is here, in this delicate dance of independence and union, that Egyptian love shines most brightly. Love as a partnership, a quiet bond of equals beneath the eternal gaze of the desert sky. As the golden sun dipped below the western horizon, ancient Egyptians believed it was not merely day giving way to night, but life itself pausing before its renewal. The setting sun mirrored their understanding of death, a passage, a journey, not an end. And just as the sun was destined to rise again, so too, they believed, were human souls. In this cycle of existence, marriage was never confined to earthly life. Love, in their eyes, did not wither at the edge of the grave. Instead, it crossed the threshold into eternity. To the Egyptians, a union between man and woman was not only about raising children, building a household, or surviving the struggles of daily life. It was also about preparing for eternity. Husbands and wives saw each other not simply as companions for the years of labor, harvests, and festivals by the Nile, but as eternal partners who would walk side by side into the afterlife. For them, marriage had a double nature, a physical bond and a spiritual one. Imagine a couple in a modest mud-brick house near Memphis. They might live much like any other family, tending goats, weaving linen, sharing meals of bread, onions, and beer. Yet when they saved scraps of money for their tomb, carved small shabby figurines to serve them in the next life, or commissioned a scribe to inscribe prayers on papyrus, they did so together. The afterlife was not something one entered alone. It was something planned for and longed for as a couple. Inscriptions carved into tomb walls give us a rare and tender glimpse of this devotion. Husbands would write to their wives, praising not only their beauty, but their constancy, their care, their companionship. One inscription, preserved from the New Kingdom, reads like a love letter reaching beyond death. "She is with me, my beloved. Her voice is my delight. Though I walk in the west, she will walk beside me. Though I lie in darkness, her light will guide me." Such words were not written for human eyes alone. They were appeals to the gods, to the eternal order of Mat, to ensure that the bond of marriage endured forever. For Egyptians, preparing for the afterlife meant carefully constructing a tomb that reflected the household they knew in life. A married couple might be depicted sitting together at a banquet table, forever receiving bread, beer, and fruit in the next world. Statues carved of stone or wood would show them side by side, hands touching, gazing forward as if preparing for a journey they would never face alone. Even in these still figures there is a softness, an intimacy that tells us that their marriage was not thought of as duty alone, but as something tender, something eternal. The tombs of wealthier Egyptians, such as officials and priests, overflow with evidence of marital devotion. The tomb of Ramos, a high official under Pharaoh Akhenaten, shows him and his wife, Merir, depicted side by side not just in scenes of ceremony, but in quiet, almost domestic poses, holding hands, sharing a gaze united in affection. In life, such depictions reminded visitors of their loyalty to one another. In death, they were a prayer, a hope that the gods would preserve that closeness forever. Even among ordinary people, whose tombs may have been little more than simple graves in the desert sand, the hope of eternal togetherness was deeply felt. Archaeologists have found small wooden stelae with inscriptions like, "May I see my wife again," in the Field of Reeds. The Field of Reeds was the Egyptian vision of paradise. As the Egyptian sun sinks low across the horizon, the Nile reflecting bands of gold and crimson, we return to the stories of love that live not only in daily life, but also in the great halls of history. Love in Egypt was not simply a quiet exchange between farmers at harvest or neighbors at festival. It was also told in legend, carved into stone, sung in hymns, and whispered across centuries. These stories remind us that even among kings and queens, love was a force that shaped memory, politics, and eternity. One of the most famous tales belongs to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, whose images still gaze at us from temple walls with a tenderness rare in ancient art. Akhenaten, the heretic king, who shifted Egypt toward the worship of one god, the sun, Akhenaten chose to display his queen not only as consort, but as Nerequel. Together they were painted with their children on their laps, kissed by the rays of Aten. A vision of family intimacy, strikingly human in contrast to the rigid images of earlier pharaohs. It is as if their love itself was a kind of devotion, a holy partnership. Though history remembers Akhenaten's reign as troubled and divisive, the art of the period preserves something gentler, a king and queen reaching for one another as hands, sharing gazes that no scribe could entirely capture in words. Then there's the tale of Ramses II and Nefertari, perhaps the most celebrated royal love of them all. Ramses, who ruled longer than almost any other pharaoh, built temples of unimaginable grandeur. And yet, within the vast stone monuments he left behind, his heart still beats in the smaller details. At Abu Simbel, in Nubia, Ramses constructed a temple not for himself but for Nefertari. The inscription above the entrance is striking, "For whom the sun rises." To dedicate such a temple was to elevate his queen in ways few others dared. Inside, carvings show her side by side with him, not behind. In the great tomb of Nefertari, in the Valley of the Queens, her beauty is preserved in radiant paintings, where she walks hand in hand with the gods as though even in death, Ramses ensured she would never be alone. Love here was written in stone, meant to endure for as long as the desert sands held against time. But Egyptian love stories were not only for kings and queens. The voices of common people reach us too, carried across 3,000 years in fragile papyrus and etched astraca. Love poems survive from the New Kingdom that speak in youthful voices still fresh to the ear. My heart longs to be close to yours. It is like being sick. The day drifts slowly toward evening, and once again, we return to the banks of the Nile. The air has cooled, the heat of the sun softening into a golden glow. The long reeds sway gently in the breeze, and the sound of water laps steadily against the shore. It is here, in this timeless place, that one can pause and reflect on what love and marriage truly meant to the people of ancient Egypt. For them, love was not just a fleeting passion or a private emotion. It was tied to the order of the universe itself. Just as the Nile rose and fell in its endless cycle, bringing life to the fields, so too did love represent balance, harmony, and renewal. A husband and wife were not simply two individuals joined together, but two halves of a whole, mirroring the eternal dualities of nature. The sun and the moon, the earth and the sky, the river and the desert. Imagine, for a moment, two lovers walking side by side at the edge of the water. Sand is cool beneath their feet, and the horizon glows with the fading colors of dusk. Perhaps they exchange quiet words, or perhaps they walk in silence, knowing that their bond requires no explanation. Around them, life continues, the call of birds returning to their nests, the laughter of children carried faintly from the village, the creak of boats drifting lazily on the current. Yet for these two, the world feels hushed, as if pausing to acknowledge their union. Their marriage is both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary because it is rooted in the daily acts of living, tending to fields, sharing meals, raising children, offering prayers to the gods. Extraordinary because it carries within it the promise of eternity. To the Egyptians, love did not end at death. It traveled with the soul, enduring in the afterlife. Tomb walls inscribed with tender words and images of couples seated together at banquets remind us that for them, marriage was a bond that extended beyond the limits of mortal time. And so, as the Nile flows endlessly on, carrying with it the memory of countless generations, so too did Egyptian love flow across centuries. It was practical, yes, bound up in contracts and property and the responsibilities of survival. But it was also deeply emotional, captured in poems that spoke of longing glances, in songs that compared a beloved to the brightness of stars, in prayers carved into stone that pleaded for reunion after death. Tonight, as we close this gentle journey, picture once more that couple by the river. Their hands lightly touching, their hearts steady as the current itself. Their lives have long since faded, but their words, their songs, and their devotion remain, echoing softly through time. And so, as the Nile continues its endless path toward the sea, carrying dreams, memories, and hopes upon its waters, let us remember. Love and marriage in ancient Egypt were not just about survival or duty. They were about harmony, companionship, and the quiet assurance that even when life passes, the bond endures. And now, as the night settles and the stars begin to glimmer above the desert, let these ancient voices fade into the background, like the sound of water flowing gently in the dark. Rest easy and let the eternal river carry you into sleep. Good night.